This is something I wrote, some of my thoughts on linguistics from about 9 years ago. Well, almost 10 years ago now. The problem of predicates. Traditional definition of predicate. An expression that is true of the subject. Well-formed sentences are composed of the subject, a noun, and the predicate, which must include a verb. Predicate logic definition of predicate. A function which relates or operates over a small number of arguments, generally from 0 to 3. These functions appear in natural languages as verbs, and their associated elements, auxiliaries and verbal inflectional morphology, particularly tense or aspect, while the arguments are nouns. However, neither of these stances are tenable. Let's consider a monovalent verb construction, which would be a verb, V, and a subject, S, and the structural relation to this basic form that verbal inflection, I, takes. Evidence from English. In English, verbal inflection appears on or near the verb. So you get S and VI. So the verb might be optional. So far, no problems. Both definitions of predicate work here. Evidence from Mandarin. In Mandarin, verbal inflection frequently appears at the clause level. So you get SVI, it's kind of the same order, but the inflection applies over the entire structure instead of just over the verb. Yeah. So I misread, well, maybe not. I misread when I said that the verb is optional in English, although maybe I didn't, because it is. You can have something like, she is. Or she runs, where run, right? The S is on runs and the is are, they're really the same thing. Yeah. The notation that I originally used meant that the inflection applies over the verb. So here, the inflection applies over the SV. So we just broke the traditional definition. So Mandarin breaks the traditional definition of a predicate because the inflection, which should be part of the verb phrase, applies over the entire structure, not just the verb. Evidence from Wolof. In Wolof, verbal inflection appears on nouns. So you get something like SIV, where the inflectional morphology is applying over the subject, the noun, not the verb at all. We just broke the predicate logic definition. The minimalist program, MP, attempts to solve this and other problems by splitting the verbal material into big VP and little VP. We'll see below that this actually doesn't work either. Further, in the literature, predicate is frequently used so freely that it becomes plainly obvious that the term is vacuous. A beautiful example comes from discussion of Salishan languages, like Lushotsed and Nukhok, where the basic phrase order is VSO. But in responses to WH questions, like who did this, who was this done to, so there's the object, or what did she do, so there's the verb. Those sorts of WH questions. But in responses to WH questions, sentences take on the phrase order of the question, which always fronts the question element. This yields the following paradigm. If the question form is VSO, so here the verb is being questioned, so what did you do? Then the response form has to be VSO. If the question form is SVO, so like who did what, who did this thing, like who chased the dog, something like that, right? then the response also has to be SVO. And if the question form is OVS, so like what did you chase, right? So English tends to front the WH question part as well. So this is pretty familiar to an English speaker. The response form is also OVS. All right, so the basic difference here between Salishan and English in the way WH questions operate is, so in English we front the WH thing, right? Like, what did she chase? Or, yeah, so there it's OSV. Because English is canonically like SVO. Meh. Arguably, that's not really right, but canonically, English is SVO, so for this, we'll just say it's like that. So here I'm fronting the object, right? So she chased a dog. What did she chase? Right? So the object fronts. But the response would bring it back. In Salishan, the object remains fronted. So it just comes straight, like the object, verb, subject, you get object, verb, subject. If it's verb, subject, object, you get verb, subject, object. Right? Just, it's a copy. In Salishan linguistics, it's often said, because of this, that Salishan languages lack a distinction between nouns and verbs. The reasoning behind this being that the languages are VSO. They're dogmatically claimed to be VSO. V being the predicate, and so when elements are fronted, they then must become the predicates of the sentence. So basically you have a dogma here that in a Salishan language, whatever the first element of the sentence is, that is the predicate, that is the verb. This blatantly violates both definitions of predicate and is clearly begging the question, even if it didn't. And here I'm using begging the question in the correct technical formal way. So a begged question isn't, the colloquial meaning of that is that there's a question that is wants to be asked or something like that, right? No, that's not it. A begged question in the formal sense is basically like somebody supposes a solution to something and just kind of assumes that you're going to go along with their supposition, right? So there's no real there's no reason that this should be true other than that's pretty much what the other person is saying, right? That's probably not the best definition, but it's along those lines. This is a very curious position to take, since at least some of the languages which exhibit this behavior have determiners, at least Lushotsed and Nukhok, which specifically only appear on noun phrases and never on verbs, under normal conditions. Interestingly, in both Lushotsed and Nukhok, determiners also appear on the verb in statements that are not verb initial. That is, in responses to questions of the form NVN, noun, verb, noun, so either subject, verb, object, or object, verb, subject. Nukhok seems to have a further rule which prevents determiners from being the first element of a sentence, which also plays into the logic that Nukhok lacks a distinction between nouns and verbs. But Adam has this same rule and is not being accused of lacking a distinction between nouns and verbs. Right? So, like, for instance, in Adam, you could say, let's see, I can't think of. Anyway, whatever. But yeah, no, you'll get things like g, right, marking a noun in Adam, and So if it's in a position after the beginning of the sentence, if it's somewhere after, it's not the first element, you'll get the g on there. But if you move it to the front, you don't get that, right? For linguists looking at nuchalk, at least classically, this was seen as evidence that the fronted element was a verb. And there's a little bit more reason to why, which is going to come up. Okay, so this yields the basic template. Noun, determiner verb, determiner noun. So it's like dog, or no, what, the chase, the you. Like, what are you chasing? For noun, verb, noun responses. But Le Chaussade has no such rule and requires a determiner on all elements in an NVN response, right? So here you get determiner noun, determiner verb, determiner noun for an NVN response. So yeah, it would be like, the question would be like, what chase you? And the response would be, the dog, the chase, the you. Something like that. Additionally, the V element of NVN form responses always takes verbal morphology, plus the nominalizing determiner, right? So the determiner indicates that the thing is like operating like a noun, right? So it's basically, it's been stripped of its ability to act as a verb. But inside this structure, you get all of the verbal morphology. So it appears that what's actually happening here is that the verb is being deranked to a noun so that it cannot project theta roles onto its arguments, a task which is instead handled exclusively by discourse history, right? So because we're just copying the question, the format of the question. In other words, these sentences lack internal predicates under the predicate logic definition, something which also happens regularly in embedded structures. Oops. Despite being well-formed sentences, because there is no function, only a specification of its encyclopedic content. And even if there was, its arguments are ambiguously marked clause internally, because there is no case morphology, but positionally specified by immediate discourse history. This last detail also breaks the traditional definition and really all possible alternate definitions which work at the clause level, or are strictly endocentric. This in turn invalidates all modern theories in formal syntax, because at the time that I wrote this, every linguist that I had ever spoken to, which included most schools, a wide enough variety that I was pretty confident that there are no mainstream theories that I hadn't touched, that I'm not somewhat familiar with. All of them felt that endocentrism was central to syntax. So there were some functionalists, I think, that didn't view that, but they don't have models of how language works, so it doesn't really matter what they're saying, because they're kind of just sitting there saying, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. They're just like debunking what the formalists are saying without really having a view of themselves. Like, okay, I know what you're against. What are you for? Right? This data was first published at least 4 decades prior to the invention of XBAR, which, among other things, entailed the abolishment of exocentric structures and syntax. Clearly, this was a mistake, as in Le Chaussade Nuchar questions cannot be answered without appealing to exocentrism. Also note that the MP tactic of splitting the verb into big VP and little VP doesn't solve anything here, since both are neatly confined to the nominalized verb element. And this was last edited at 2 o'clock UTC, January 10th, 2012.